Welcome to the Max Future Weekly Podcast. All Apple talk and no chit chat.
Okay, welcome to episode 130 of the Apple Podcast. This is Lex at Max Future, and today is November 21st, 2012, and it's been a little while since we've done the Apple Podcast, and there's a lot of stuff to cover and go over, so let's get to it. This is a chit-chat-free podcast all about Apple, Apple-related products, Apple news, Apple devices, and so let's talk about it. Here we go. Okay, so a lot has transpired since the last Apple Podcast. It's been a while. Haven't been able to do it regularly, among other things. We were hit with a pretty big hurricane here on the East Coast. And, but a lot of Apple news has transpired since the last time, I guess I did the podcast, which was, I think, towards the end of October. I want to say it was, I don't know, maybe let's see, we can go back and see exactly when it was. I think it was, here we go, October 23rd. Wow. So it's almost a full month has passed since the last Apple Podcast. Today is November 21st. And a lot transpired. And among other things, let's talk about one of the big things that happened, which was that Scott Forstell was essentially fired by Apple. And it was an interesting announcement. It was an announcement that came down on October 29th, which was just when the hurricane was hitting, I guess, New York. It was sort of like a stealth announcement, and basically Apple issued a press release entitled "Apple Announces Changes to Increase Collaboration Across Hardware, Software, and Services." And this was kind of a bombshell, and was basically on the 29th, Apple said, Apple today announced executive management changes that will encourage even more collaboration between the company's world-class hardware, software, and service teams. And it goes on to say, as part of these changes, Jonnny Ive, Bob Mansfield, Edie Q, and Craig Federighi will add more responsibilities to their roles. And it goes on to say, Apple also announced that Scott Forstell will be leaving Apple next year and will serve as an advisor to CEO Tim Cook in the interim. And, there's more to the story. It also announces at the end of the press release, quietly, that Jonnny Browett is leaving Apple. And that's all it says about him. He was the guy who was hired, I think, less than a year before by Tim Cook to become the new head of the Apple retail stores after the prior head of the retail stores, I think Johnson was his name, who really built up the stores, left to become the CEO of, I think, J.C. Penney. So this was a major, major shakeup. And Scott Forstell was a really significant executive at Apple. He's a guy who went to Stanford, and then I think his first job was at Next, which was Steve Jobs' company that he founded in the late 80s after he was booted out of Apple. And Forstell was Steve Jobs' guy, and he's credited with really leading the team that developed the operating system for the iPhone and then the iPad iOS. And, so Apple didn't say why, Forstell was leaving, and Apple doesn't say, quote, he's fired, but, in an unceremonious way, it's announced that he's leaving. Nothing positive is said in the press release about him. Like, we want to thank him for all the, the great years of working on iOS and building it up. And there were all sorts of stories on the internet as to the reasons why he is being forced out and why there's this reorganization. And a number of things have been reported. One thing that was reported is that, he was responsible for the new Apple Maps in iOS 6 not being up to snuff, and when it was sort of released with the iPhone 5. it was sort of heralded by Forstell as being this great map program that was going to compete, with Google Maps, and a lot of people are disappointed that the data is not very accurate and that there's issues with it. And if you recall, Tim Cook, on behalf of Apple, apologized that the maps weren't as good as they could have been. So a number of people have either reported on rumor or speculated that the reason Forstell's going is because he's the one who screwed up the map function. And some are reporting that the reason he is being told to go is because he did not want to apologize. In other words, the original release that Apple drafted, that Tim Cook signed, was originally going to be attributed to Forstell, and Forstell refused to, acknowledge or apologize that there was something wrong with Maps. So that's one thing that was reported, that was something he refused to do, and so Tim Cook fired him. Another thing that was reported was that he was difficult to get along with, and that in particular he did not really get along with Jonnny Ive and Bob Mansfield. And, Jonnny Ive is the designer, the hardware designer who designed the iMac and the iPod and the iPhone and the iPad. And he was, supposed to be very close with Steve Jobs. But Forstell was also supposed to be close to Steve Jobs. So nobody knows exactly why, he's leaving. The people who know the most why he's leaving are probably Forstell himself and Tim Cook, the CEO. So supposedly Mansfield, who heads up like Macintosh hardware and stuff. Now remember, in the summer he announced that he was retiring, and then after a few months he came back in this other position. And some of the rumors say that he came back because he might have been assured by Tim Cook that they were going to get rid of Forstell. So some of the speculation is that Forstell didn't get along with Mansfield and Jonnny Ive, and there were stories or rumors coming out that the tension was so difficult between Forstell and these other executives that they couldn't even be in the same room together. And there was a book that came out, or an article that came out like a year before, by one of the business writers who basically said that Forstell was highly ambitious and saw himself as like the replacement for Steve Jobs. And so, my view is that it could have been for a number of reasons. It could have been that, he wasn't taking responsibility for problems in iOS, the operating system. I mean, one of the other criticisms with the Apple's operating system for the iPhone and the iPad is that it's skeuomorphic. And skeuomorphic is the concept of taking software and putting in design elements that are highly reflective of the real world and not the digital world, to try to create the appearance that, for users, that it's easy to use. So, for example, having like leather stitching, digital leather stitching in the Calendars app, or having the podcast app look like a reel-to-reel tape is playing. The argument would be that's skeuomorphic, and a lot of people who are tech-minded find that kind of insulting and ugly. On the other hand, I have to say that I think lay people, everyday people who use digital devices, are given a degree of comfort by having things skeuomorphic. And if you think about it, the whole concept of the GUI interface that the Macintosh, was the first to use back in the 80s, I mean, even that is skeuomorphic, right? Because, I mean, Apple had a garbage or trash can, a garbage can. They had a desktop, and the concept of a desktop is skeuomorphic. In computer, there's really no such thing as a desktop. That's just a metaphor for a way to think and organize things digitally. So I don't know if that's the reason, but it looks like there's a number of reasons, and Tim Cook decided to reorganize Apple, and Forstell's out, and basically Jonnny Ive now is going to have a bigger role. It says here in the press release, Jonnny Ive will provide leadership and direction for human interface across the company in addition to his role as the leader of industrial design. His incredible design aesthetic has been the driving force behind the look and feel of Apple products for more than a decade. So it looks like Jonnny Ive, who's been in charge of the hardware design, is now going to be also in charge of the look and feel of the software design. And, nobody knows what kind of software design experience he has, but he probably does have good taste, and maybe that's what they're looking for is, a unified good taste by him. So that's pretty interesting. The release goes on to say that Edie Q, who's up to now been in charge of, I guess, the iTunes content, says Edie Q will take on the additional responsibilities of Siri, Maps, placing all our online services in one group. This organization has overseen major successes such as the iTunes Store, the App Store, the iBook Store, and iCloud. This group has an excellent track record of building and strengthening Apple's online services to meet and exceed the high expectations of our customers. Now, it's interesting, it refers to this organization because it starts off the first sentence by saying Edie Q will take on the additional responsibility of Siri and Maps. And then it goes on to say placing all of our online services in one group. So Edie Q is like Edie Q and his group. It must be a group of like his people. So they've been in charge of the iTunes Store and App Store and iBook Store. Now those things are mainly content. Yes, there's some design elements that are important in that, but his big thing, Edie Q, is content. Now iCloud, I guess he's been responsible for that. It's about giving a better user experience with online services, which had previously been Mobile Me. So he's probably done a good job of scaling iCloud services, and so he's probably tech-minded too. But he's also getting these two other somewhat tech-minded areas, Siri and Maps. Siri is highly tech-minded. If you think about it, it's voice recognition and instruction in the cloud, so and at a large basis. I mean, you have the iPhone, the iPad, all sending these voice dictation and voice instruction to servers, and so he really needs to be someone sensitive and understanding how large servers and cloud processors can quickly turn around and handle that kind of data. And similarly, Maps is a huge endeavor. Google spent years creating Google Maps, gathering data and refining it so that the data is good. And so Edie Q is going to have to excel at that. Now, Edie Q is heralded with making all sorts of great content deals, and to some extent, Maps includes making content deals. The current version of Apple Maps has Yelp data in it, and so maybe Edie Q is going to be able to go out and negotiate deals with other data providers that are relevant to Maps. I guess municipalities or companies that have data on all sorts of municipalities that can be sort of brought into Maps. So it's interesting that he's getting this responsibility for performance and content. The release goes on to say Craig Federighi, who's done some of the presentations that Apple has, he'll lead both the iOS and iOS X development, and it goes on to say Apple has the most advanced mobile and desktop operating system, and this move brings together the OS teams to make it even easier to deliver the best technology and user experience and innovations to both platforms. Now, I think Federighi, prior to this, was mainly focusing on the Mac operating system, where Forstell had the iOS, and so now it looks like the Mac folk, or a Mac guy, is going to be heading the iOS part, and it's all going to be unified. Look, my theory is this makes sense also because I think in the long run you're going to see a complete unification. I mean, I had this vision years ago, and I think I blogged about it, that one day you're going to see convertible iPads that turn into MacBook Pros or MacBook Airs. Already in the Windows 8 environment, like Acer or those companies have made these sort of convertible tablets that can be transformed into a notebook or be a tablet. I think Apple's eventually going to go to that. I mean, I always thought that Apple one day will go to having some of the iOS apps run on a Macintosh. I mean, how cool would that be? Apple, remember when the iPhone came out first, and then when the iPad came out, Apple did a very clever thing. Apple basically said iPhone apps would run on the iPad even if they weren't redesigned to fit on a bigger screen. So Apple allowed iPhone apps to run at its native size or just double the size by just pressing this 2-time button in the right corner. So I always thought, wouldn't it be cool if you could run on your Mac any of the iOS apps just as widget apps or in some sort of virtual box? Because look, with Xcode you can run a virtual iPhone or iPad on your Macintosh to test an app that you're developing. But what if Apple basically created Macintoshes that with an operating system that would allow it to run all the apps that you have in the App Store for iOS? That would be huge. Now, one challenge with that is that the iOS apps are built on a touch interface. But it is conceivable that one day Apple will create a way to do a touch interface with Macintoshes. And maybe the whole point of that will be so that you can run your iOS apps on a Mac. Or quickly turn like a MacBook Air. I always thought you could have it so that the screen of a MacBook Air could slide over the keys and then become a tablet. In other words, you hide the keys. If you had some way for the screen of a MacBook Air to slide over and cover up. But the trick there is going to be the engineering for Apple to make a MacBook Air so thin and so light that when it's turned into a tablet, it's not going to be that much heavier than a tablet that's not convertible. But anyways, I do think that iOS and iOS OS X for the Mac are going to eventually converge. So it does make sense to have that reorganization. So that's also part of the reshuffle with Forstall's departure. Okay, so another part of the release then goes on to say that, quote, Bob Mansfield will lead a new group, Technologies, which combines all of Apple's wireless teams across the company in one organization, fostering innovation in this area at an even higher level. This organization will include the semiconductor teams, which have ambitious plans for the future. Now, what's interesting about this is Mansfield's really came up through creating the hardware for the Macintosh. And what's interesting is here that his team will combine all of Apple's wireless teams. So obviously, this technologies group is going to not be focusing on the Macintosh, because the Macintosh, let's face it, it's getting to be a smaller and smaller part of the revenue for Apple. And in any ways, the computing is going to the iPad and the iPhone and these mobile devices, because they are becoming powerful. And that's the future, I think, of computing. So he's going to have like this new group of technologies that's going to sort of cut across these different teams, like the semiconductor team and other like areas of technology. And I think what Apple wants to do is have someone really focus on cutting edge technologies that can be used and incorporated in these mobile devices. And so this is kind of an exciting area, and I think a big challenge, because Bob Mansfield's role is going to be to push the envelope of technology with the iPhone, with the iPad, with the iPod Touch, with the iPad Mini. So this is kind of huge. And, maybe it's a big challenge for him, and it's going to be pretty interesting. So what are if you think about it, like the future, what kind of technology? Well, we want to have more powerful batteries that last a long time, so they don't have to be so heavy and they can get lighter. We're going to have probably better touch technology that's even more responsive and more accurate. Right now you can use a stylus with an iPad, but it only has so much detail that you can use with the stylus. You can't get as pinpoint as you would like. And I've seen some technology where you can create sort of virtual 3D within the iPad. Maybe that'll be built into it. Maybe there'll be additional sensors. NFC technology has not been incorporated in Apple devices. Maybe Apple will develop its own electronic payment system that it thinks it's better than NFC. Maybe that'll be something. And then processor speed. There's an arms race as these devices, become more and more used as computers. There's more and more of a need for them to have, faster and faster processors using these ARM designs for chips. So he's going to have a big role, and I think that's very exciting for him. Now the release goes on to say, additionally, John Browett is leaving Apple. A search for a new head of retail is underway, and in the interim, the retail team will report directly to Tim Cook. Apple's retail organization has an incredibly strong network of leaders at the store and regional level who will continue the excellent work that has been done over the past decade to revolutionize retailing with unique, innovative services for customers. So why is Browett out? And in some ways, Browett is Tim Cook's really big first mistake, because Tim Cook hired Browett, and he came from this European or British company called Dixon's, which was like an electronics retailer. And a lot of people, when he was hired, were scratching their head because the Dixon stores are not considered, to be the kind of prized retail experience that is comparable to the Apple retail stores. I think it was who Ron Johnson had operated the Apple stores, and the Apple stores are just phenomenally successful. They are the highest grossing per square foot stores in the world, I think, just blowing away smaller retailers like Tiffany's, which, sells expensive jewels. And shortly after he was hired, or a while ago in this past year, there was some online concern that he was being kind of a jerk in how he was treating employees of the retail stores, that he was putting quotas on them for, sales, or that he was cutting back on their hours. And so there was a little bit of a revolt, and he just may have come into Apple and done things in a very un-Apple way. One of the virtues of the Apple stores is you don't feel any sort of high pressure tactics when you go in there. You really feel that it's like this oasis where you can just at your leisure look at any Apple device, use it, play it. You can even send email while you're there, and it just makes it really comfortable. And there are all these Apple employees, and they're trained not to engage in high pressure tactics to sell anything. They're very respectful. They might say, hey, do you want Apple Care? But they don't try to convince you to get Apple Care. And so maybe this guy was coming in and he didn't really understand the Apple way and the Apple brand, and maybe he's just a difficult guy and wanted to just sort of boost the sales of the Apple stores. And because it is pretty phenomenal for that one, some guy at that level not even lasting a year with Apple, because he's been at Apple less than a year, and he came into this really high profile position as the head of the retail stores, and he's gone. They don't even say anything. He's positive about him, and he's sort of buried at the end of the press release. So he must have really just done a bad job, because executives in major companies like this don't get hired and then fired in less than a year. So it's it's got to be pretty devastating for him that he's getting kicked out, and we'll have to see who they get. I think they should frankly promote someone from within. There's got to be talent within the retail stores that is exceptional and knows how these retail stores operate. Really, why did Tim Cook feel the need to go out to an executive of Dixon's? Because, Apple is the greatest retail outfit ever created. These stores are phenomenal. So why do you need to go? What president of what other retail company is going to have better tricks up their sleeve than anybody who's been trained in the Apple stores or as an Apple executive? So, I found his appointment to be bizarre and his firing to be bizarre. And, hopefully that's the only misstep that Tim Cook has. Now, the other thing that's been going on since, I guess, the last Apple podcast on October 23rd is that Apple stock went into a major slump. Now, when was it? Like at some point in, I'd say, middle of September, Apple stock peaked at a little over $700. And since then, as September went forward and as October went forward and as November went forward, Apple stock just declined and went down all the way down to like 506 or something like that, 506 or 520. And it was a major decline, and it's hard to say like what is the exact reason. It could be a number of things. Apple had its quarterly announcement in end of October, and Apple beat its own estimates, but it was just a little short on its earnings estimate for the Street's consensus, and it was also a little short, let's say, on iPad sales for the quarter that ended at the end of September. And so that could have been part of the reason it went down. Also, in terms of fulfilling iPhone 5 orders, it hasn't been able to make as many as what demand is, and so there's like a bit of a wait for that. And then, there's also the iPad mini. It's unclear how many it's going to be able to make of those, and there's a demand for that and a wait for that. And then also, this thing with firing Forstell. And then, of course, the stock market also has been struggling because of problems in Europe and problems with the economy and worries after President Obama was reelected. The next day, Apple stock went down a lot. And some of the stories said that it's because a lot of hedge funds or investors want to take profit in Apple stock because they're worried that if they sell next year, they'll be subject to higher capital gains taxes if the president passes or increases the capital gains taxes. Now, disclaimer, I own Apple stock, so I'm an investor in Apple, and so I'm not making any recommendations here. However, it's interesting that Apple stock, I guess, finally then rebounded in the last few days. And so it's now trading at $561, and its PE ratio, the price earnings ratio, is a pretty low. It's 12.72. What's interesting is if you factor in that Apple has something like $120 billion in cash, really of the 561 share price, $120 of that is really cash that Apple has or investments that Apple has. So theoretically, if the market cap right now of Apple is $528 billion. If you had $528 billion and bought Apple, you would immediately get that cash in the securities that Apple has saved up. So it wouldn't really cost you $528 billion. It would cost you like a little over $400 billion to buy Apple. So by some metrics, Apple stock is cheap. And I think one of the reasons that, it's not, the stock price isn't higher is that Apple's so huge, maybe a lot of investors are worried of how is Apple going to continue growing its profits and its revenue, because if Apple stops growing significantly its profits as it has every year, quarter after quarter, then there's a belief that the stock isn't going to go anywhere and it's just going to be sort of flat. Now, some people believe that the coming quarter, the quarter ending in December, Apple could have a phenomenal quarter. and that's because the iPhone 5 was upgraded right before the quarter started. The iPad mini was released just now at the beginning of November, and the iPad 4 was surprisingly revealed just now, and also the 13-inch MacBook Retina was just revealed. And what else? And the iMacs are going to be released at the end of November, and in December the new iMac. So Apple has all these new products, including the iPhone, for this quarter. And last year Apple just had the iPhone 4S that was new, and Apple then ended up having a phenomenal quarter for the holiday quarter. So we'll have to see. Nobody knows exactly why stock prices go up or down, but it's unclear what's going to happen to Apple. But it's interesting that it went all the way up to 700 and then retreated down to 500, a little over 500, and now it's at about 561. So it's been a pretty volatile time in the last few months regarding the price of Apple stock. Now, in terms of more recent news, something pretty nice happened yesterday, at least in terms of the iPhone. A while ago, or during the summer when Apple rolled out iOS 6 or announced iOS 6, Apple announced that FaceTime would be supported over cell data connections, that it would not only be over Wi-Fi. Now remember when FaceTime came out, I guess a year or two before, it only worked over Wi-Fi, and on iPhones it only worked over cell data if you jailbroke your iPhone and used some third-party jailbreak app. So Apple announced in the summer that iOS 6, which came out in the fall, would support FaceTime over cell phone data connection. This is the whole video conferencing that's built into the iPhone as well as the Macs and the iPads. But AT&T said that it would only be supported if you had a shared data plan. And AT&T and Verizon both rolled out these shared data plans where you can share data among different devices. But really, they're kind of expensive plans. They only save you money if you already have a lot of separate data plans that are expensive. And for me, it would never make sense to, the way I use it, to leave my unlimited data plans. So they AT&T said it was only going to be available on those plans, and a lot of people complained, and some consumer groups were going to complain to the FCC. And then, I don't know, maybe a week or two ago, AT&T said that it would support FaceTime on other tiered data plans that are not shared data plans, but it would still not be allowed on the unlimited data plans that are grandfathered in. And so, people like me are still upset about that. But then Cult of Mac, or I think it was Cult of Mac, or Mac Rumors basically reported that some users found that AT&T has turned on FaceTime over all cellular data connections, including grandfathered unlimited data plans, which I'm on. Now, I'm on LTE speeds for AT&T, and AT&T said for the unlimited data plans, they will throttle you once you hit 5 gigabytes a month of data. But I tested this last night, and it worked. So AT&T hasn't specifically announced this, but it is the right thing to do, because you shouldn't cripple an app because you don't like how much data it uses. If you have AT&T did tell users like me that they're going to throttle us at 5 gigabytes, so it's up to us to stay under 5 gigabytes. So to me, that was a really nice little surprise yesterday, and hopefully it'll stay implemented. I mean, I do think that one of the problems with AT&T is that with FaceTime is it's great if you use it to communicate with family members and friends who have Macintoshes or iOS devices, but it doesn't necessarily work with other protocols. What would be cool is if Apple allowed it to make just voice calls and had a service through iTunes where you could use voice over IP to make calls to landlines, and to cell phones, because that would be cool, because then you could use your iPad or even your iPhone over Wi-Fi to make voice over IP calls. You can already do that with Skype on the iPhone or the iPad using the data connection. And the thing is, Skype is now owned by Microsoft, and Microsoft is integrating Skype into its Windows 8 phones. So Apple really, and Google obviously has Google Hangouts, and which also work on the iPhone, but Google Voice. So Apple needs to really improve and expand FaceTime. So one of the ways I think Apple can expand FaceTime is allow it to make audio calls to phone numbers, maybe free in the United States like Google Voice, and maybe for a low rate overseas like Google Voice or Skype. And they could just charge the App Store. But I think Apple should also consider making it maybe cross-platform compatible. Maybe Apple can talk to Microsoft about allowing Skype calls to come into FaceTime, or FaceTime calls to go to Skype, because it is, there's an arms race going on, and everybody wants to make their mobile platform be highly competitive. And so Microsoft has Skype, which they're going to integrate into Windows 8, and Google has an Android, Google Voice, and Google Hangouts. And so Apple should really step up the game with FaceTime. Apple didn't really step up the game with Ping, which it killed this year, the social network for iTunes. So Apple really needs to think about how to leverage FaceTime so it's used more often by more people. That's these are huge challenges Apple faces. Now the next story hits close to home, and it is Apple related. One of the two of the podcasts that I like to listen to are 5x5 Network's podcast by Marco Arment, who's also the developer of Instapaper, and John Siracusa, who writes for Ars Technica and has his own hypercritical podcast. And I was kind of stunned to hear, I guess in the past week, that both of them are ending their podcast in December. And Marco Arment, as I was listening to, said basically he feels his show's getting stale and he just has not as much to say. And I didn't hear Siracusa explain why he's ending his podcast, but Dan Benjamin, who I guess runs the 5x5 Network, said that it's just a lot of work for John Siracusa. And so I'm kind of sad because I'm a podcaster and I like doing it, but I also like listening to podcasts, and I thought those were two of the finer podcasts, and I got into a routine of listening to them. So it's kind of sad that they're not going to be running their own podcasts, at least those podcasts. I do think that Marco Arment could have, he has plenty of material. It doesn't have to be one thing or another. Here I'm doing this for fun. I think as long as there's Apple-related stuff, I'm going to have Apple-related stuff to talk about. I just do this by myself, but I enjoy doing it. Sometimes I do go for a couple of weeks, or in this case, a month, without doing a podcast, but I'm up to 130, and I'll try to continue it. I do this for the sheer enjoyment of it. This is not a money-making activity. This is really just a hobby, and I enjoy, talking about Apple news, Apple products, and if at least one person listens to this, I'm happy. I don't need millions of people listening to this. It's really the act of doing the podcast is itself fun and therapeutic. It makes you think about these issues and these topics, and you'd be thinking about it anyway, and so it's kind of cathartic to talk about it to an audience and get it out, because then you can move on and talk about other topics. So Anyways, if you haven't listened to the Hypercritical or the Build and Analyze podcast by Arment, you should. I guess those episodes will stay up, and they're very good programs, and I am going to miss them. Now, one of the things that makes the Apple ecosystem, I think, really good is something that a lot of people don't talk about, and that is Apple's Airplay standard, which allows iOS devices to send wirelessly through a Wi-Fi network content to an Apple TV. And if you get a certain app that works on the Macintosh, you can send iOS content screen, the screen of an iOS device like an iPhone or an iPad or an iPad mini to a Macintosh. And so it's a great feature. I mean, I use it a lot to send video and audio from an iOS device to a big TV to watch. And now word comes from, I guess ZDNet has a story that Google is to challenge Apple with an open Airplay standard. This is a story by Adrian Kingsley Hughes, and he says that speaking to GigaOM, Google product manager Timbo Drayson admitted that Google has its sights set on the space, which is Apple's Airplay, and plans to pursue it aggressively. He's quoted as saying, "We really want to move the whole industry forward," said Drayson, before going on to say that Google is, quote, actively working with other companies, end quote, to make this an open standard that could be used on a number of platforms. It goes on to say Google's primary motivation for developing this protocol is likely to be to enable content sharing between Android smartphones, tablets, and Google TV devices. And it says that the protocol Google is working on allows for data to flow in both directions, which would enable developers to build second screen experiences that correspond to what's happening on live TV, and for the beaming content from your laptop to your TV. The article points out that Airplay isn't the first wireless streaming standard. There's something known as the Digital Living Network Alliance, is a collaboration. So, look, I'm sure that Google's going to try to go with something that's an open standard, but the thing is, what's nice about Apple's Airplay works really well among Apple devices. And I think one of the challenges for this kind of technology is when you have them on different devices and different TVs with different hardware capacities, the consumer could end up having lousy experiences, because the more televisions that have this open standard made by different hardware manufacturers, the more there's a likelihood something could go wrong. But I do think Apple could sort of beef up Airplay. I mean, I think Apple has to be more aggressive in licensing Airplay technology. I would like to see TVs made by other manufacturers have Airplay built into it, so that you don't have to buy the Apple TV for Airplay to work. It would just work. Airplay is great as a presentation device. Like if you have your iPhone or your iPad and you want to make a presentation, you have a Apple TV connected to a projector and a Wi-Fi network, you can just wirelessly run your presentation. Well, I would like Apple to have, like, let's say Apple TVs with Airplay have built-in Wi-Fi built into it, or have Airplay work over other wireless technologies like Bluetooth 4.0, or create something, even create some sort of wireless standard that doesn't need a Wi-Fi router or a Wi-Fi network. Wouldn't it be nice if an iPhone or an iPad had some sort of wireless chip that could just beam content to some other device that has the wireless chip? Because it would be great then if you could have projectors that just wirelessly work with the iPhone or iPad without an intermediary Wi-Fi network or an Apple TV or an Airport Express. I mean, it should be just a standard that goes device to device. So you should be able to sort of beam from an iPhone or an iPad directly to a TV, or directly to a projector, or directly to an audio player like the iHome, all without why do you need to have a wireless network established? I mean, why can't you just have some beaming going on, directly? Part of the challenge could be that, how are you going to get a powerful enough beam if you don't have a wireless network like a Wi-Fi? But anyways, obviously this feature that Apple has, Google is trying to copy. Google pretty much copied the concept of iOS, smartphones with the Android phones, and Google is obviously going to try to keep up with whatever features Apple has that are successful and that the consumer likes. So I'm not surprised by this story. Now, I thought I'd start talking a little bit about the iPad mini. I've had two iPad minis now for several weeks. They came out, the Wi-Fi version, several weeks ago. And I got a white one and I got a black one, 32 gigabytes. And at first I got them because I just thought I wanted to see what the white one and the black one look like, and maybe return them or keep one. But, I got a blue cover for one and a pink cover for another. And I gave one to my daughter and one to my son. And they love it. They're they're crazy about it, and I think the iPad Mini is going to be a huge hit. Its lightness and its thinness are quite stunning. I have an iPad third generation and an iPad second generation, and the thing that really strikes me about the iPad Mini is that it really does feel like a different device. It is so thin and so light. It's so easy to hold. And that's its virtue, and it has great battery life, and it feels zippy. But you shouldn't really underestimate what kind of change having that form factor, that thinness, that lightness, what it does to a device. It just makes it feel, I don't think of it as an iPad, I think of it as an iPad mini, something that's highly portable. It's, I have some coats, some winter coats, and I was able to put both of them in a pocket, like when I'm traveling with my kids, and so that part of it is great, and the kids love it. They actually, as a gaming device, it is better than the regular iPad for kids, just because it's so light. Even for adults, the iPad, the third generation and the fourth generation, are kind of heavy. And so if you're gaming a lot and holding it horizontally or vertically, your hands get kind of tired with the fourth and third generation iPad. And with the iPad mini, they're just so light and thin and easy to hold for kids that kids are going to flock to these devices. They feel like kid devices. And they're good for adults too, because if you want to do some reading at night. Now, one of the areas that it doesn't shine is that it's not a Retina display. And that generally is not a problem if you're just looking at email or reading the web, or if you're playing games, or looking at your Twitter. But if you're doing a lot of reading, you do kind of miss the Retina display of the iPad third generation or the iPad fourth generation. And also, if you're looking at a lot of PDF documents in, like, let's say iBook, it's not a great experience because the fonts aren't big enough to really see well, and you got to sort of blow it up with your hand, but then it's not easy to scroll. iBooks are easier to read because they tend to render better than the PDFs. So, it's when the iPad mini goes to a Retina display, it's going to be truly phenomenal. And I think basically, people are going to have iPads in different sizes for different purposes. For more work and content creation, people might, if they're doing work like reviewing a lot of documents and writing, they're going to maybe stick with the larger iPad. And then, if they're going to be more mobile and on the go or want to play games, they might use the iPad mini more. And frankly, I mean, the way I view it, I have three different iDevices. I have the iPhone, I have the iPad mini, and I have the iPad, the large generation one. So I think it's a major hit. I think people are going to use it. I think it's going to sell like hotcakes. I don't think it's going to really cannibalize the third and the fourth generation iPad. I think some people are going to have two iPads, like an iPad Mini and an iPad, and it's just kind of a stunning new addition, I think, to the iOS device. So it's I wouldn't be surprised if Apple announces lots of these being sold when it comes out with the quarterly results in January. And one of the things that I'm really looking forward to that aren't in the stores yet, but which Apple announced, are the new iMacs. And the new iMacs, there was a rumor that they were going to be further delayed. Apple announced that, I guess, they were going to come out in November and December, that the the 21.5 inch was supposed to be shipping in November, and the 27-inch in December. And then they said there was going to be further delayed, but more recently Mac rumors said no, they are on time. And I guess they're reporting on what 9 to 5 Mac reports on. 9 to 5 Mac, according to Mac rumor, says that Apple's original plans are still intact for the iMac, and they're going to be shipping soon to distribution centers. Now, the big thing about the iMac that I'm really looking forward to is actually two things that really kind of excite me. So Apple made them be extremely thin. They're not thin in the middle of the back where the guts of the computer are, but it tapers off to be like hyper thin on the ends. And so eventually they're going to get even thinner. So this is pretty cool aesthetically. And also the screen is going to be better in terms of its glare factor. I think they reduced the glare factor and made the screen and the glass merge to be even closer together. So that's cool. But the other thing that's really cool is Apple has this new technology called a fusion drive, and basically Apple is going to let you order this fusion drive, which is actually two drives. You're going to have an SSD drive and a regular, let's say, 1 terabyte hard drive. But in Mountain Lion, Apple's done it so that you don't see it as two separate drives. You see it as one drive, but then the fusion drive process in the back of the operating system smartly moves like programs that you use a lot to the much faster SSD drive, and then the data and the programs that you don't use as much to the regular drive. Now, SSD drives are phenomenal. I sent my 2010 iMac, which had only one regular terabyte hard drive. I sent it to Otherworld Computing, which had a turnkey program last year. I sent it to put in an SSD drive in addition to the regular hard drive. And the SSD drive that I put in, because my iMac only takes 3G SSDs, and it gets read-write speeds, the SSD, of 260, 270 megabytes per second. A typical hard drive that I have in there gets maybe 50, 60, 70. So the SSD drive is like 5 times faster, and this can really affect your performance when you're using a computer. That's one of the reasons the MacBook Airs are so fast. Isn't because they have fast processors, it's because they run off of SSD drives. But the one downside to the SSD drives is that you don't get a lot of storage for the same dollar amount. So for example, you could pay a little over $100 for a SSD drive, but you might get like 128 gigabytes. Now, for that same amount of money, you could probably get at least a 1 terabyte hard drive. And so I have, an SSD drive and a hard drive, but I have to be careful about not, my operating system is on the SSD drive, and some programs will automatically, let's say, put stuff on that. Like if I download a lot of stuff, if I don't change that setting, and it's not easy for the average person to change it, my download file gets big. It could swamp the SSD drive, which is only 128 gigabytes. But what Apple's done with this Fusion drive is basically say, look, we're going to give you speeds that are close to just having an SSD drive, but we're going to do it by creating this operating system that knows when you really use something a lot, so we'll put it on the SSD drive, let's say your browser you use a lot, and by having it on the SSD drive, it's just going to make the whole experience of using your browser much faster. Now what's interesting is people figured out, and if you go online, there are ways to go into the terminal, and if you have an SSD drive and a hard drive, create your own Fusion drive, because if you have Mountain Lion, you can, using terminal instructions, and somebody figured out a hack for that, have it do a Fusion drive even though you don't have the latest iMac or the latest Mac Mini that support Fusion drives. So I wouldn't suggest doing that unless you're really comfortable doing this and formatting hard drives and SSDs, and unless you're comfortable backing up everything in case you lose it. So, but I think this kind of technology is very clever of Apple. Apple's always looking to push the envelope, and some providers like Seagate sort of had similar technology, but it wasn't as elegantly executed. Seagate would sell like a hard drive that maybe had, I don't know, some small amount of SSD in it, but nothing like what Apple's doing. So, I do think it's impressive how Apple's sort of pushing the envelope with their computers and their mobile devices. One of the other notable things with the iMacs is they don't have any optical drives in them, and I think that totally makes sense. I hardly ever use optical drives on my computers anymore. Apps are all downloaded. Even movie content is frankly downloaded. I mean, we hardly ever get DVDs. So I do think this is the way to go, and I can't wait really to go to an Apple store when they're on display and play with one of these brand new iMacs. So that's something to definitely look forward to. Okay, so that's it for episode 130 of the Apple Podcast. This is Lex at Mac's Future. Thanks for listening. Remember, this is a chit-chat-free program all about Apple-related news, Apple products, Apple interest, and you can support this show by going into iTunes and give it a positive review. I've done 130 episodes, and my goal is to try to stick with this and keep going and not give up, because I do think there's always something interesting to talk about in the Apple world, the Apple community, and I plan to stick with it. So thanks for listening, and see you next episode.
This has been a Mac's Future production.